Hello, I'm Zarin, and this week we're going to talk about a mystery that has haunted mankind for literally thousands of years. Where is Atlantis? Now, there are archaeological teams all over the world right now looking for this legendary lost continent. They're in Cyprus, they're in Santorini where the volcano Thera existed, they're in Spain, they're in Bermuda, they're in Asia Minor. They all believe, all these archaeologists believe they have discovered the location of Atlantis. But they're wrong. This description of Atlantis is quite specific, and it is in this book, Timaeus and Critias by Plato. And it is quite clear that he has stated in there where it is and how large it was. Now, Plato is the first reference in history that we have for Atlantis, but he does specifically say, and I'll quote, he was listening to Solon, who was a Greek legislator who had traveled to Egypt earlier on, and had been talking to the priests of Egypt in this one temple, and they told him of an ancient civilization that existed many, many years before the Greeks. And they referred to it as the age of our institution is given in our sacred records as 8,000 years, and the citizens whose laws and whose finest achievements I will now briefly describe to you therefore lived 9,000 years ago. We will go through their history in detail later on at leisure. And what that means is they were the Greek Solon was being told by these Egyptian priests details about a land that existed 9,000 years before this time, and this was around 300 BCE, which is before the Common Era, or before Jesus was born. And then Aristotle starts to describe what he learned from Solon about the actual location and size of Atlantis. And let me quote from this. Our records tell how your city checked a great power which arrogantly advanced from its base in the Atlantic Ocean to attack the citizens of Europe and Asia. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable. There was an island opposite the strait which you call the Pillars of Hercules, an island larger than Libya and Asia combined. From it travelers could in those days reach the outer islands, and from them the whole opposite continent which surrounds what can truly be called the ocean. For the sea within the strait was what we're talking about is like a lake. And what he's referring to at this time is that when you look at a map of the globe, this right here is the Strait of Gibraltar. When they refer to the Atlantic Ocean, the true ocean, they're talking about this great big vast ocean. When they're talking about the lake, they're talking about the Mediterranean Sea. So there's a big difference between what's in here and what's out here. And Plato specifically states that the island continent is to the west of this Strait of Gibraltar, or the Pillars of Hercules as they were known among the Greeks. Now we know from Plato that Atlantis was on this side of the Straits of Gibraltar, which are right here. Right here. And that everything in there was the lake, or Mediterranean Sea as the Greeks called it, or the Egyptians called it. And we know that Plato says that it was larger than Libya, which is this place, and larger than Asia, which is what the Greeks referred to as Asia, was actually what we call Asia Minor. Combined, those are two pretty big spaces. The Greeks didn't know there was all of this, which we currently call Asia. But that's still a pretty darn big space, and if you take those two areas and combine them, they would cover the entire Mediterranean Sea, more or less. Now, he does state that the navigation, this opening or the Atlantic was navigable at that time, which means something happened since the time Atlantis fell that made this muddy, and I can explain that later. I've actually written a book about Atlantis called The Karmic Memory of the Rise and Fall, which the first book is out now, and it's called Paradise. But let's take a look at these two land masses, the Asia Minor and Turkey Minor. I made some tapes, and I placed them in an area which I believe is where Atlantis was. Now, some people believe it was over here in Bermuda. Some people it was here in Santorini. Some people believe it was in Cyprus, which is right about here. None of them are right. They're not the right size, and they're definitely not at the right time. 9,000 years before the time of Solon would be 9,000, basically 9,000 BC. And that's a long ways before the time the Egyptian pyramids. They were built around 5,000 BC, so that puts Atlantis at least 4,000 years before the Egyptian pyramids were made. So I went and took 2 tapes that would approximize the mass of the Libyan area, and this is a conservative. I didn't take in the whole country of Libya or the whole Asia Minor. I just took in Turkey and Libya, the top part. And I put them together and laid them over here, which is where I believe Atlantis actually was. For some strange reason, the ocean currents seem to work here too. For some reason, they flow around this landmass. And I placed what was actually the size and shape of Atlantis right here where it was. And if these 3 ovals are the actual 3 concentric circles that form the barrier that they passed through to get to the main city, which was Atlantis. So, I placed it here for a reason. There is something here. Something that exists right underneath that area, and it's a very strange area. It's called the Sargasso Sea. And this sea is very strange. These currents, for some reason, keep flowing around us as if they remember something was there. Now, the Sargasso Sea is very strange. It has nothing but seaweed in it, and the winds don't flow well there. The only time you get real wind there is occasionally a hurricane will come along and make it a little windy. They tend to follow this path, one of these currents. And then they come up in here and they go up that way. But they don't go directly to it. They go around it. And there's a reason. There must be something there, or was there at one time, that all this ocean current remembers was there and continues to flow around it. Now, I believe if the archaeologists were to go down to the bottom of this sea, they would only find a huge pile of rubble. We all have imprinted on our minds, seared on our mind, the 2 trade towers in the World Trade Center as they collapsed, how they turned into dust, small pieces, and just collapsed all the way down to the bottom. Atlantis was supported by something which you can only discover in one of my books, because I don't want to give away all my secrets. But when this disappeared, the entire continent sank all at once into the ocean. Now, what would cause a continent to sink into the ocean? And Plato does not refer to Atlantis as having blown up or a volcanic eruption. There's nothing mentioning a volcano of any kind. It says it sank into the sea in one single night. Now, that requires a tremendous mass of land, and you saw how big it was there, to sink all at once. And that means it was supported, much like the World Trade Center was, by something that supported that weight. And this World Trade Center was held up by steel girders that failed, and when they failed, the weight just came crashing down. Same thing happened with Atlantis. But imagine this. What would happen to all that water if that landmass suddenly sank into the sea? Well, it would create tidal waves of colossal proportions. And if you'll notice, Plato did say that the Atlantic Ocean was navigable at that time, which means a huge wave of water must have come across, hit everywhere on the world. It would have traveled all the way around the world, hit everywhere, and must have torn up a lot of the seabed and carried a tremendous amount of dirt, land with it. And it would have raced across the ocean carrying a huge amount of sediment. And when it got to this one location, it sort of got a little like in a vise. It could go over it, and it did, but it would have deposited a lot of that detritus right here. And so for the longest time, there was a huge amount of mud right there, and nobody can explain why. So, this is where the Sargasso Sea is right now. It's right here on the Earth. Now, Bermuda is here. There are other little areas around here that could have indications of Atlantis. But what do you think they would find if they were to go to the bottom of the Sargasso Sea? They would find a lot of rubble, much like they did when the 2 towers fell. And I doubt very seriously they would find any artifacts, because most of the things that were made of paper or wood or anything made out of biological materials would have long degraded. But all stone monuments, all buildings, they would have collapsed and crushed by this rubble. But I'd be willing to bet there's a great big huge mass of rubble right here, and there's no explanation geologically as to why that would be there. But right now it's covered with a huge sea of seaweeds. It's called the Sargasso Sea because the seaweed there is called sargassum, and it literally covers it and is deep there. So something is keeping it there. Also, a lot of the garbage around the world seems to end up there. Everything seems to go there for some reason. It's almost like the Great Mystery is telling us that something was there and we need to take note of it. Now, we probably won't find any remnant of Atlantis here, but we might find remnants of Atlantis elsewhere, high enough to where this huge tidal wave that raced around the world didn't destroy everything along the coast and deep inland. That tidal wave could have been as much as 2 to 3 miles high. That's a lot of water to displace. So they might find remnants of Atlantis in places like Cyprus, Santorini, Bermuda, anywhere, or Spain, because they had colonies. Matter of fact, Plato refers to there being 10 colonies. I think he's making reference to a closer to his time civilization, because he did say in the Critias and Timaeus that the Greeks of Athens at that time defeated the Atlanteans. But their power had been taken away from them, and they were very weak, so anybody could have beaten them at that time. So here's where it was, right there. Sargasso Sea. That's where it's located. If you don't believe me, take a good look.